Hey everybody, a quick word before we begin. This episode explores a side of adoption stories that we don't hear about very often. We're talking about mothers who relinquish their child to adoption, how it happens and how it feels. So if you're an adoptive parent, I think some of the discussion might be hard to sit with, but I do think it's worth doing. And the book that we're looking at mainly focuses on systemic issues that shape the adoption system in traumatizing ways for these relinquishing parents. So the goal is not to criticize or attack adoptive families. It's to encourage us to imagine more equitable circumstances for the future. We also talk a bit about abortion, so keep that in mind and take care of yourself as you listen. And before I conducted this interview, I also reached out to some relinquishing mothers. And I want to say I'm really grateful to the ones who spoke with me on background to help get me oriented. And with that, let's go. Welcome back to Relationscapes. It's the podcast where we explore human identity and human connection in order to make the world a little better for everybody. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and our guide in this episode about adoption is sociologist Gretchen Sisson.
We have this idea that there are so many children in need of families. And in fact, when you look at the private adoption system, we have up to 45 families that are waiting for every infant available. So you have very, very high demand, very, very low supply, right? This is economics 101. You have high demand, low supply. This is going to be expensive. And you're also incentivizing agencies, attorneys, brokers, advertisers to find more ways of generating supply, which is, of course, babies.
It's not just agencies, attorneys, brokers, and advertisers who want to generate more adoption supply. The U.S. Supreme Court has joined the effort. When they overturned Roe v. Wade and allowed states to ban abortion, several justices pointed to adoption as the solution to forced birth. Conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett, herself an adoptive parent, said there are plenty of families ready and waiting to adopt. But her argument leaves out a basic question. What happens to the people who give birth and then relinquish a child? What about the birth mothers? The justices ignore them. Sociologist Gretchen Sisson does not. She spent years interviewing women who placed their children for private adoption, and her research suggests that for many, relinquishment carries lasting trauma and pain, and that the so-called choice to relinquish often appears at moments of crisis when women are broke, isolated, and stigmatized. It's not much of a choice at all. She says adoption can create some loving families, but it's also a system shaped by unequal conditions that limit who has a real choice about it. Gretchen Sisson joins us to talk about her book, Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood, right now. Gretchen Sisson, welcome to Relationscapes.
Thanks for having me, Blair.
I imagine that this book is not going to be an easy read for people who have adopted children, and because I wouldn't necessarily call it a pro-adoption book, which might be surprising for some people to hear, because I think most people have a pretty positive view of adoption. It seems like a great way for families who can't have kids to grow, or for people who don't want to have kids to give a child up for adoption or whatever. And having read the book now, I see that's not necessarily the story that you're telling here. So what went through your mind as you were approaching a book about adoption? Like, did you have friends who have adopted that you had to be like, okay, I don't have to kind of think about them as a potential audience here?
Well, I think it was very important that when I started doing this research, I didn't know I was writing a book. When I started doing this research, I was finishing my doctoral dissertation, which I never expected anyone to read. But I didn't come in with a certain set of political ideas about adoption. The arguments that I make in the book are arguments that come out of the data, that come out of the experiences that my research participants shared with me. And my job as a researcher is to document what I have been told and what my research has shown me. And my job as a person is to frame that from a perspective of justice. And if I'm making a call to action, or if I am depicting what types of calls to action should be made by people who are impacted, driven by that data, that's my job as a person, right? Is to bring that lens to the scholarship that I'm generating. None of my jobs are necessarily to uphold systems of power, even if people in my direct circles have benefited from them. So it is an uncomfortable book for adoptive parents to read. I have heard from a lot of adoptive parents who've read this book a range of responses. Um,
Hmm.
and I will say, adoptive parents that are open to this conversation, that are really willing to examine their own power, that are really willing to think carefully about what they have relied on to build their own family, they come away from it very committed to changing these systems for the betterment of their child. I do have adopted people in my life. I have adopted families in my life. I'm not an adoptive mother. People often ask me, am I an adoptee? Am I a birth mother? Am I an adoptive mother? I'm not any of those things.
Yeah.
But I do have people close to me that are all of those things. And what I always say is being critical of the system of adoption can be a way that you express your love for the adopted people in your life. And that, in fact, your love for adopted people in your family, in your community, can be what animates calls to make a system that is more rooted in justice and autonomy and empowerment rather than the one that we're currently using.
Yeah, I think one thing I would say to people who might be nervous about reading it if they've adopted kids is that nothing in this book implicates necessarily any particular individual about what's happening. It really takes a critical look at the system of adoption. So I think if they can buckle down and kind of lean into that area of the discussion and not feel personal blame for the shortcomings of that system, then, like you said, I think people could be motivated by the book that you produced.
Well, and I think we all benefit from different systems of power in different ways, right? Whether that's
Sure.
racialized institutions and systems of power, class-based, gender, like we all
Yeah.
participate.
The clothes that
Right,
we wear, the food that
right.
we eat.
We are
Yeah.
all complicit to different degrees in the inequities of this world. It's just a question of what we feel called and capable of commenting on and changing, and how we try to shift those systems more broadly. And so, as you said, this isn't a condemnation of individual adoptive parents. And people, I think, often come to adoption because they believe that it is a better way of forming families, because they believe that it is altruistic, because they believe they are meeting a need. And for those people, I think it's actually really important to understand how the system of adoption actually functions and who it actually serves and who actually holds the power, so that you can begin to understand where you fit in that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about language before we continue. You have a really important discussion that you put in an appendix at the back, and I actually think it kind of represents the heart of the book itself, and it's how do we even talk about this? The kind of language we even decide to use kind of stacks the deck toward a positive view of adoption or a negative view of adoption or something somewhere in between. In fact, there's even terminology for this. You talk about positive adoption language and honest adoption language. Explain the difference between those two and how that comes up in your book.
So positive adoption, and I didn't make up these terms, right? But positive adoption
Yeah.
language is a set of dictions and terminologies that the adoption agencies have largely adopted. So, for no pun intended, yes, of course. That they have largely used and encouraged others to use. So they'll say that a mother places her child for adoption to imply a neutrality about that action, but also to imply a certain amount of agency, that they are choosing to place the child for adoption, and there's intentionality and care there.
Yeah.
They'll refer to mothers as birth mothers. They'll generally refer to adoptive mothers just as mothers, occasionally as adoptive mothers. So it's really about upholding the primacy of the adoptive family. Honest adoption language, and I'm putting that in quotes because I think that these are all, whether or not any of these
kind of
terms,
a loaded description,
but whether or not any of these are honest depends on the reality that you're trying to communicate, which I think varies depending on your position here.
Right.
So
positive to who? Honest to who? Right.
So honest adoption language was kind of coined in response to this, quote, positive adoption language that agencies were using. And honest adoption language would refer to a birth mother as a natural mother, a first mother, or just as a mother. It would refer to adoptive mother always as an adopted mother, sometimes as adopter, if they don't want to affirm the parenthood of that person or that individual. Rather than placing for adoption, it'll use the term surrendering. And I think that rather than choosing adoption, it would talk about being forced. It brings in a greater sense of coercion that you see at play. There's also a lot of language about whether you call the adopted person an adopted person or an adoptee. A lot of adopted people have different feelings about that, as you'll see.
Or like adopted child, right?
Adopted
because it's
child,
like some of these
right.
people are like adults.
Right.
Oh, that's the
That's
adopted
the adopted
child. They're like, I'm
Yeah.
40.
Yeah. And I think a lot of positive adoption language does focus on the babyness or the childness of the adopted person without acknowledging that they are going to be adopted for their entire life. There are certain ones that I use pretty carefully in my own writing and my own speaking. I use adopted people. Most adopted people are okay with the word adoptee, but some aren't. And so adopted people, I think, one, doesn't imply a juvenility to them as they get older. But I think it also just affirms their personhood and who they are as they grow. Some adopted people feel that adoptee suggests that they are a part of a transaction, right? And I think that's quite true, but they want to resist that in some ways. I mean, I use the words that people use to describe themselves. So most of the women that I interviewed would describe themselves as birth mothers. Some describe themselves as first mothers, natural mothers, mothers of adoption loss. When they had specific terminology that they preferred, I used that when talking about their stories. The biggest language choice that I made, of course, is the title, is relinquished. And I think that relinquishment, and I use the term relinquishing mothers a lot.
And I'd never heard it before I read your book, by the way.
Yeah, I think it's, look, I didn't use that in the recruitment materials for participants, because if you said relinquishing mothers, then people don't generally identify that way. They think of birth mother because a lot of them are first come into that identity because they're interacting with adoption agencies.
Yeah, and they gave birth to the child,
gave birth to
too.
the child,
So, yeah.
Of course. And so I go back and forth. I use all of these terms, but I think relinquishment implies a sense of constraint, if not coercion, that I found in a lot of the stories. But it also has some ambiguous, right? You can relinquish something of your own volition. You can relinquish something because you are forced to surrender that thing in a relinquishment. And so I think it gives a range of those connotations, with probably more of the connotation that there is some pressure on this choice. There is something that is limiting your full autonomy in making this choice. And that's really what I wanted to convey with the title.
Yeah, and we'll unpack that more as we go. And I should note, you conducted over 100 interviews with women over a 20-year span. You were focused mostly on private domestic adoption. And also, there are gender identity issues, too, when we talk about labels, because not everybody would identify as a mother. But I think in your surveys or in your interviews, there was one non-binary person that you knew of, right? That you interviewed.
Well, he
and no dads.
Well, it gets a little complicated. Who I interviewed and who actually ended up in the book.
Let's do it. Yeah.
So I did interview some fathers at first, and I didn't end up including them in the book for a number of reasons. One is there were like fewer than 5 of them. They were facing a different situation. And all of the fathers that I interviewed were still partnered with the mothers that I was also interviewing.
Okay.
And so I felt like it was better, and just my lens as someone who is coming at this from a reproductive justice perspective, a feminist perspective, I felt that the story that I wanted to tell was really one that was particularly about motherhood in that way. And so I ended up putting the data from the interview with the fathers aside, and they're not included in the book. But I did that data collection, right? I know their stories. I have that kind of in the back of my mind as I'm writing, as I'm thinking about fathers and kind of what next future research questions could be. There was one person that I interviewed at the time that they gave birth. They identified as a woman, as a mother. By the time I interviewed them, they identified as non-binary, using they/them pronouns. And by the time the book came out, he had fully transitioned and was using he/him pronouns and now identifies as a trans man. And I asked him, as I was doing final revisions on the book, how they wanted to be described. And he said he still thinks of himself as a mother for that child. And he was comfortable with the word mother being used to describe him. And so we sort of kept it at describing him as a non-binary person, because that's who he was at the time of the interview. And so I use the word mother specifically and intentionally in a way that he still feels included by that. But man, it's tricky.
I'm glad you were
it's
clear in the
tricky.
book that was kind of your scope, because you do have to make a decision about it. And there are calls for more research, and there are more people doing this kind of work. So for the purposes of this interview, this gives people a sense of kind of what we're going to be talking about today and what might not get focused on as much. So let's turn to the first chapter of the book, Where Do Babies Come From? Because here you place adoption into a larger conversation about family separation in U.S. history. Not necessarily just about adoption, but about what families are worthy, who gets to have families, what families need to look like. So you go back to enslaved Black women and indigenous women whose children were taken away. So why start there for this conversation?
Broadly, I wanted to help the reader understand that throughout American history, families have been separated for many different reasons. They're not mutually exclusive reasons, but it could be reasons of economic gain. Right. And that can either be because there's a value on the child themselves or because of the labor of that child.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look at American enslavement, there is a value on the labor of the child. When you look at the orphan trains that shipped, or most of them actually had living parents, but shipped poorer, usually immigrant children from East Coast families to the Midwest, that was often done for the value of their labor.
Mm-hmm.
There's also separating families as a threat, right? A way of extracting obedience, a force of social control for parents. This, of course, you also see in enslavement, right? That the threat of being sold away from their children, having their children sold away from them, was a way of rendering enslaved people more and more powerless. You also see this, of course, in the separation of Native parents from their children and their sending to boarding schools. And you see this today in the criminal justice system and in family policing, the child welfare system, where the threat of family policing really is a way of socially controlling certain populations, particularly of Black people.
Yeah, and you'd find like Black women relinquishing because of the threat of Child Protective Services taking away other children that they had, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the last one that is really most directly tied to the Native boarding schools is genocide and assimilation, right? That separating children is a way of breaking a culture. And you see this in American history through the Native schools, but you see this happening today in Russia, which is taking Ukrainian children and raising them as Russian, right? That this is a tactic of war, is family separation as a way of kind of not just breaking a spirit, but breaking a cultural continuity. And so you have all of these different forces. And I think in private domestic adoption today, you see all of these coming up, right? You see the intersections with family policing and child welfare. You see the money that is being made and the market demand for children. You see some of this cultural assimilation idea, the idea of transracial adoption as kind of this post-racial idea that removes children of color, particularly Black children, from their communities and families of origin and places them in overwhelmingly white spaces. So you see all of these at play. And I think it's very easy to think, oh, adoption today doesn't have anything to do with enslavement, 350 years ago. And for the most part, that's true, right? A lot of the forces are very, very different. But I think it's important to understand that the reasons for family separation endure in a lot of important ways. And those systems, today's family policing, child welfare system that comes out of kind of this Jim Crow state that came out of enslavement, and these patterns that we see that are still separating families are not wholly independent from these histories.
Right. And like you said, it's something that's really hard to sum up. And I'm sure there will be other episodes, and there's other books in your book as well that kind of go into more detail about this. But effectively, we moved from a system where people were commodities, children were commodities for what they could produce. Then they became commodities as something families wanted. Families wanted babies. We entered this era where now the adopter was going to pay for this to happen. And there's a rise of this adoption industry. How did we get there?
So Viviana Seltzer, who's a sociologist at Princeton, she wrote a book called Pricing the Priceless Child. And it traced at the beginning of the 20th century this shift from valuing children because of the economic value that they provided a household to valuing children because of the value of them intrinsically, the value of being a parent and having children. And I always say, I have 3 children. Literally none of them contribute anything economically to my household, right? I didn't have them because I have domestic labor that I need done. It would be nice if maybe they could get the clothes in the hamper, but like that's the bar we are at this point. No one's doing farm labor. No one's doing domestic work, right? They're not adding value to our household at this point.
You're not apprenticing them out or maybe getting a bride price.
Right. They're still young, so we'll maybe keep that one on the table for the future, but not yet. And so I think that was a big cultural shift where people began having children not because they started having fewer children because they weren't of economic benefit, but they had them because they wanted to be a parent. They wanted to raise a child that was a project worth engaging in that had its own value inherently. Around the same time, a woman named Georgia Tann, who ran the Tennessee Children's Home, started developing this idea of private adoption as we practice it today. And so I think it's really important for people to understand we think of adoption as an institution that has always existed. Now, children have always had external care outside of their immediate biological families, but adoption as it exists today, 120 years old.
Yeah.
And I think that this is not something that has endured throughout American or even human history. This is a practice that's relatively new. And what Georgia did was basically steal children. She would steal children from poor families. If a poor family brought a very sick child to the doctor, she would take the child and tell the family they had died. If the children were dropped off at school, she would just pick them up and tell them that they had been taken to a better home. She was persistent and egregious and extremely Machiavellian in her intelligence. So she would facilitate adoptions for people with a lot of power. She facilitated adoptions for the governor of New York. She facilitated adoptions for celebrities, actresses in Hollywood, right? People who had the ability to not just shape the laws around adoption, but to shape the stories that were told about adoption and the way that we were thinking of adoption. And so right at the same time as people are beginning to value children for the sake of having children, you have this person who's coming in and creating a for-profit system and who has the ability to bring in these really powerful people and make them deeply committed to this as an institution. There's a brilliant book on Georgia Tann called The Baby Thief by Barbara Raymond. Really recommend it. And look, whenever you boil a critical moment in history down to one villain, you're oversimplifying a little bit. But this is about as close as you can get to one person really shifting the course of history around how we understand private adoption and how families are formed.
And it's easy to see, actually, how this could catch fire and could spread because the same ideas that people think today about adoption, you can see how they worked in that context, which is this is giving these babies a better life. This is a better thing. Like these other families aren't even worthy of having these kids. And isn't this wonderful that we're placing them in these better circumstances? And that's one of the justifications today that people will give for why adoption is necessary or why that it's good. You write about this in the book, is because this is giving children a better chance. And relinquishing parents are often told that.
Yeah.
Don't be selfish. Think about your child, without mentioning, of course, the negative side effects and the negative things that happen in an adopted child's life.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that myth is not just one that they are told. It's one that many of them come to believe because most relinquishing mothers very much do want to parent their child. But they get to a point in their pregnancies where that feels very impossible. And once they are interacting with an agency, the adoptive families and profiles seem to speak to all of the insecurities that a relinquishing parent is experiencing. So what might that look like? It might look like they don't have stable housing. Their partner or potential co-parent isn't present or, isn't supporting them or isn't interested in parenting with them, or is entirely absent or in some circumstances is abusive and dangerous to be around. It might look like their own parents kicking them out of the house or saying, you can't live here anymore if you bring home a baby. It might look like, not having stable work, stable income, a reliable car, a way of getting childcare, any of those pieces. It might look like struggling to finish school and not knowing how to do that when you have a child. And the agency will put in front of these mothers profiles that speak to all of those insecurities. So look at this potential adoptive family. Here's their gorgeous home in the suburbs while you're dealing with housing insecurity. here are pictures of not just their siblings and their nieces and nephews, but their own parents who can't wait to be grandparents again, all while you are partially in this situation because of the lack of support from your own parents. Here are their beautiful wedding pictures. They've been married 10 years, right? They are so excited to be parents. And one of the formulas that's often used in these prospective parent profiles is to have, and they're usually heterosexual couples, but to have the husband write about the wife and the wife write about the husband and say, like, I can't wait to see my wife as a mother. She was born to do this job. Or, my husband is going to be such a great father. He's excited to teach the kids this, this, and this, right? All the while, the expectant mother is without a partner or without a trustworthy or reliable partner and trying to figure out how to piece this together on her own. And so it's so easy to buy into the idea that what adoption is offering is a better life. And they are often not just told that, but they are convinced of that. And rather than finding ways to offer them support to raise their child, which is what they often want, they are given a way of giving their child to someone else and told that's the best answer.
I liked the stories that you put between chapters because we really get to hear the voices of some of these moms directly for pages at a time. And more than one of them brought up money. And often it was an acute crisis. It was something immediate, like maybe they faced eviction or they couldn't afford to get an apartment or something like that. And in a lot of cases, something like a couple $1,000 actually would have made it work for them, right? You say that addressing their immediate financial needs and connecting them with government resources would have made it possible for them to mother when that is exactly what they wanted to do. But instead, a lot of this money is being redirected to adoption agencies and to advertising for adoption and paying for abortion crisis centers where they're pushing people away from abortion toward adoption, even though people that go there aren't necessarily only thinking of abortion. So the money thing really, when you take a look at what's being spent and how these prospective mothers could actually be helped in the short term, it's a tragedy.
Yeah.
It's a tragedy.
Maybe this is a good moment to sort of step back and talk a little bit about the economics kind of on a broad level, because we have this idea that there are so many children in need of families. And in fact, when you look at the private adoption system, we have up to 45 families that are waiting for every infant available. So you have
That stunned me.
It's massive. It's massive. And that's an estimate. But, agencies that I talk to say, well, we don't have 45 families for every baby, but at least 10, right? So like even it's at least 10 times the supply.
Yeah.
So you have very, very high demand, very, very low supply, right? This is economics 101. You have high demand, low supply. This is going to be expensive. And you're also incentivizing agencies, attorneys, brokers, advertisers to find more ways of generating supply, which is, of course,
AKA babies.
Babies. And when you look at what agencies are spending money on, oftentimes they are spending more on marketing than they are spending on support for birth parents or even on legal fees.
Yeah.
This marketing is targeted advertising to vulnerable pregnant people. So I always say your phone, one, knows if you're pregnant. Two, it knows where you are. And so if you are pregnant and you're going to an abortion clinic, a methadone treatment facility, a public hospital, anything that implies that you are pregnant, poor, unsure, in a crisis, you're going to start getting advertisements for adoption agencies, prospective adoptive parents, adoption profiles. Those are all going to start coming up on your social media. I get them, because of the things that I search in the course of my research.
Yeah.
I get these ads all of the time. Especially, I was pregnant with all three of my children. Over the course of collecting this data, I would get them a lot when I was pregnant. And you'll see them pop up. And as I say in the book, no mother is giving her child for adoption simply because of one Instagram ad. But it can provide the basis for connection, for desperation, for a sense of inadequacy, for an initial connection to an agency that kind of keeps that ball rolling in that direction.
A possible option.
Right. It's critical. And I think that's the important dynamic to understand. People think adoption is expensive because of support for birth parents and lawyers. And that is not true. Adoption is expensive because there aren't enough babies out there. And so you have to pay all of these players to find a child. And then when you look at the supply side, as you said, most of these mothers would have needed just a couple $1,000s to stabilize their life. And people push back on that, saying it costs a lot more to raise a child. And I know,
Sure.
right? Like, I'm familiar. But I think
Yeah.
that what they're saying is not, I need $1,000 to raise this child. It's, I need $1,000 for a security deposit on a new apartment. I need
Mhm.
$1,000 for a used car so that I can get to work and childcare
Mhm.
and move into an apartment further out that feels more affordable. I need $1,000 so I can get a crib and a car seat so I know how to get home from the hospital and I can create a space in my life for this baby.
Or finalize a divorce from an abusive partner or
Exactly.
something.
And
Yeah.
they're looking for kind of this stopgap amount to navigate this current crisis that they are having so they can get to the other side of that. They're definitely going to need more support than that afterward, right? They're going to
Mhm.
need the involvement of a robust social safety system to help with housing, food security, childcare, education, all of those pieces. But what they're looking for is the amount that it takes just to get from A to B, and they'll figure out how to get to Z later. But it's that early step that's broken where the adoption inserts itself.
That's Gretchen Sisson. We're talking about the book Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. So we've talked a little bit about why women relinquish. Let's talk about options counseling. This is also something that I learned about in your book that I hadn't really heard about before. So many of the mothers that you describe throughout the book didn't really get options counseling. It's a sort of counseling where a professional sits down and goes over the actual range of options that faces a person when they're expecting a child and what they might do with it. Talk a little bit about options counseling, and I just want to point out only 7 states require it for adoption to happen, whereas 32 require counseling prior to abortion. So the deck is stacked hard against real options counseling.
Yes. And I think this gets at the bigger abortion versus adoption question, because we have this idea that women are choosing between abortion and adoption when they're facing
Hmm.
a crisis pregnancy or an unplanned pregnancy. And in fact, that really wasn't the case for most of the mothers that I interviewed.
Right.
Most of
This
them
was another surprise.
most of them didn't want to get an abortion at all. Some of them did, but most of them didn't want an abortion, didn't try to get an abortion. They continued their pregnancies because they wanted to parent, and then that plan fell apart later in their pregnancy, well after the point at which they would have considered an abortion. Some of them did try to get an abortion, and they couldn't, and then turned to adoption when abortion was no longer a possibility. So adoption is really best understood as a position of constraint. They want to parent. They can't make that path work. They wanted an abortion. They couldn't get one. And so now they end up with adoption. Very rarely are they choosing between the two. I don't think any of the mothers were actually choosing between the two, which doesn't mean that they didn't consider both at different points, but they weren't sort of contrasting these two ideas.
Well, you point out in the Turnaway study that there were 160 women in there who were denied abortions. They were too late or couldn't get one where they were at. And then only 15 of those went on to
Yeah.
relinquish their infants. The rest of them raised it. That's a really small percentage when you
Yeah.
think about it that way. That's 9%.
9%, exactly. And I think my colleague, Diana Foster, who ran the Turnaway Study, she wrote the book called The Turnaway Study, which I also really recommend to folks when we kind of got this 9% finding. So this was women who wanted to get an abortion, showed up to get their
Yeah.
abortion, couldn't get one, were turned away. 91% of them were raising the child that they gave birth to as a result of that denial.
Yeah.
And Diana compares this number, this 9%, to the fact that 100% of these women didn't want to have a baby. Right. And she's like, why is it so low? And I compare the 9% to the 0.5% of the overall birthing population that relinquishes. And I'm
Right.
like, oh my gosh, it's astronomical. Right. And I think
Right.
what it shows is it seems high compared to the overall birthing population, because as soon as you constrain choices, as soon as you take away choices, you can meaningfully drive up the adoption rate. But if there is any other option available, then people will not choose adoption. If they can find a way to parent even after they've been denied access to an abortion, that is what they are going to do.
Yeah.
But to get to your question about options counseling more broadly, I think it's very hard for people who are struggling with what to do and how to do it to find places of support. So even really wonderful abortion clinics that provide really good care and counseling, they will often do not full options counseling, but they'll do what's called abortion counseling, which is they'll do counseling with a patient who comes in to see, are you wanting this abortion of your own volition? Is anybody coercing you? Do you feel comfortable and okay with this choice that you've made? And just doing enough counseling with them so that that person can go through their abortion and not feel coerced or feel regretful after the fact. But a lot of those clinics are understaffed and underpaid and don't have a lot of space, and they don't necessarily have the time to sit down with someone.
Or they're being closed down.
And then they increasingly do not exist in a lot of parts of this country. They don't have time to sit down and be like, oh, you don't really want to have an abortion, but you don't know how to parent, and they don't have time to struggle with all that complexity. They just have time to kind of do this, like, is the care that we are about to provide you appropriate and suitable care for you? If not, we'll go home and think about it, right? Because they don't necessarily have the capacity to do full options counseling. Whereas adoption agencies, the counseling that the mothers reported getting at adoption agencies was often quite biased towards relinquishment, right? Was very much about—
because that's their product.
Because that is their product, exactly. And it was really about promoting that. There are a few spaces that are really good. So there's an organization called All Options that provides free talk line counseling to talk through all of your options, just as it says, and to kind of weigh those feelings. There are a couple of abortion providers or adoption agencies that do really, really good work and full spectrum options counseling, but it's a time-intensive process to say, well, let's think about what a parenting plan might look like. What kinds of support would you need? Here are the referrals. Here's how we can make that possible. And so I think real options counseling is very hard to find. And as you say, in most states, it's not required at all before an adoption plan is made.
I also remember, I think there was one adoption agency that did really good options counseling, and then by the time you finished the book, they were like closed.
Yeah,
right. Which is
right, because they don't
speaks
have.
to
They don't have. They didn't have enough babies because they were actually meeting people's needs. Yeah.
I feel like if agencies really took it that seriously, they would really harm their bottom line, and that's a market problem.
Well, the agency that people often ask me, like, well, what is a good agency to refer people to if we have a referral? There's an agency, I'm in San Francisco, so I point that when I talk about them because that's the way Oakland is. It's over in Oakland. It's called PACT, Adoption Alliance. Their new executive director, she was the director of Birth Parent Services. Now she's the executive director for the whole agency. She is herself an adoptee and a birth mother. And so she understands these experiences. She's worked with these families for a long time. But what's unique about PACT is that adoption services facilitation is just one part of what they do. So a lot of what they do is providing lifelong support services for adoptive families and adopted people. And so if they didn't do any adoptions all of a sudden, or if they didn't happen, or whatever, they would still have at a business model of robust services that they are offering people. So they are not reliant on adoptions happening in order to keep the lights on and keep providing those other services. And I think that's really important.
And that's a choice in how they structured their business. Then. Like that's, okay. Well, let's talk about what a lot of adoption agencies don't want to perhaps talk about a lot, and also what isn't shown in a lot of the media depictions of adoption. The media, like the TV shows we usually see, have to do with the adoptive family. So you see like a mom in a hard circumstance, and then there's a heart-wrenching scene where she relinquishes the child, and then the family goes off, and then they kind of have their life. And that birth mother, or whatever term we use, drops out of the story at that point. And your book says, actually, that's where we really need to lean in at that. What happens to the relinquishing parents after that adoption is finalized? They've had the baby, they've signed the papers surrendering any legal rights with regard to the child, and then they're kind of gone. And your book walks alongside those women as they describe really excruciating pain and long-lasting trauma. There's a quote here where you say, "The intense sense of loss and sadness immediately after the adoption came up in nearly every single interview." What are these women going through after they have relinquished their children?
I think there is a very, very profound grief and sense of mourning at that point for almost every mother that I interviewed. Even ones who remained optimistic about the adoption, because they're also postpartum, right? And so they're dealing with the hormonal transition, which leaves mothers, even in the best of circumstances, deeply emotionally vulnerable at the same time that they have lost their child. and they have very, very little support. If they had...
And their physical bodies, too.
Right.
They've just gone through it.
And if they had a strong support system around them, they would have their child, right? So anything that made them vulnerable to the adoption in the first place is also a limitation on the support and love that they have around them after the adoption has occurred. And so for some mothers, this was a very deep grief. For some, it was a depression that lasted quite a long time, postpartum depression. Some mothers began using drugs and alcohol very soon after their child was born. That would often jeopardize the open relationship that they might have with their child's adoptive family. But it was also sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, oh, well, good thing she didn't parent because now she's drinking,
Mm-hmm.
right? Good thing she didn't parent because now she's using drugs, when that was part of the loss and the trauma that had occurred. And without a support system.
Or she dropped out of school, or she lost her job,
Right. And so I think there were a lot of vulnerabilities. A lot of them, but I should also say, because I don't want to over-pathologize them, a lot of the mothers that I interviewed were incredibly strong and resilient people. And that really acute grief, they were able to power through. And that doesn't mean that they were less traumatized. It might mean that they had a partner around them that they could share that experience with. It might mean that they could afford therapy. It might mean that they had another child that they were already raising that kind of forced them to get through their day-to-day so that they could move forward a little more. So a lot of them made it through without some of these more because human beings are resilient. We get through losses and traumas all of the time. Some of them, this was a very acute, immediate derailing, and some of them, it was a lot of grief and a lot of mourning and a more temporary thing. But that doesn't mean that they weren't carrying the trauma with them in other ways over periods of time.
Yeah, and you talk about how open adoption is more common today than it used to be. So back when it was mostly closed adoptions, there was a lot of trauma that would just be long-lasting, a lot of pain. The more open adoptions tend to have better outcomes, but there's still difficulties there, and there's not a lot of coaching on how open adoption should work either. And what I didn't know, again, so many things before I read this book, is there's really not any legal agreements about open adoptions. This is to the discretion of the adoptive parents, and it's basically kind of up to them what they want to do. And there's some big obstacles that come up in the relationships between a relinquishing parent and an adoptive family. These are like money, politics, religion, and race. Give us a sense of the obstacles that you would want a relinquishing mom to think about when she's like, well, it's an open adoption, so at least there's that. What's she facing?
Yeah. It's important to recognize that the closed adoptions of the past were also much more likely to be coerced adoptions. And so when we talk about closed adoptions and the trauma, it's hard to separate, well, were they traumatic because they were entirely closed? Were they traumatic because they were coerced? The answer is both. But it's hard to know kind of which one of those factors was more crucial to that.
There you go, being so sociological, but go ahead. No.
But I think what's most important about openness today is that adoptions wouldn't happen if they weren't open. Mothers, for the most part, would not agree to an adoption if it meant that they were going to lose contact entirely with their child. That openness is a way of making adoption more appealing to mothers who are in crisis, because it lets an agency say, you're in the driver's seat, you can pick the parents, you're still going to know what's happening to them, you're going to get pictures every birthday. And there is a value to openness that's real for the mental and emotional health of the relinquishing mother and of the adopted person. And then there's also a marketing value of openness in that the industry relies on openness in order to facilitate any adoptions. Of the mothers that I interviewed that wanted a closed adoption, would have said they preferred a closed adoption, they were first of all, there were only like 3 of them. And they were in unsafe living environments. One was still living with her parents, and her father was not a safe person in her judgment to have a child around. She was still 16 and living with her father. So really, who we're taking care of in this situation is really telling. And one, it was her
Yeah.
partner who was abusive, right? So they viewed the closed adoption as the only way of guaranteeing the child's safety. They all wanted to open those adoptions once they achieved safety over a period of time. And so I think it's important to think of openness in that way. One, it adds real value, but two, the industry now is premised on it. But openness is very hard to navigate. And I always say openness can go very wrong, right? Because once the adoption has been legally finalized, birth parents do not have a legal right to see their child unless the adoptive parents allow it. And so sometimes adoptive parents who have agreed to an open adoption will cut it off completely or will limit contact and in ways that are deceptive or manipulative, right? Once they no longer have to obey. In some states where there is some amount of legal enforceability to openness agreements, it might require the birth parent to have an attorney to enforce that openness agreement.
Right.
It might require them to go in front of a judge and argue why they should have right. And these are pretty high bars for a lot of mothers who are usually pretty poor to start with, who don't have a lot of resources to spend on this.
It's also a big gamble, too. You go to court,
right.
like, that's it. Like, the family's going to connect with you again after that. If
you lose. Yeah. And do you want to put your child through that? Right. A lot of them are trying to weigh on. So like even when they're enforceable, that's a dubious benefit to a lot of parents. And so you have those cases where the adoptive parents are not fulfilling what they said they were going to fulfill. But then you also have cases where adoptive parents move, right? Families move, or where they become estranged over time, or where kids just get busy and they don't have time to visit you for a year or two, or where you have a shift in political belief that is hard,
Yeah, like the women who were evangelical and like pro-life who then sort of shifted their beliefs because of everything they went through, but yet their child's adopted into a highly religious family who now sees them as sort of this bad influence that they kind of want to keep away.
Right. That was a pattern that I heard these stories and I was like, that's interesting that happened to you. But it came up a number of times because a lot of these women were relinquishing their children because they came from conservative communities. That's part of the reason why they didn't consider having an abortion. And in a lot of more religious communities, adoption is not just a better life, but it's a way of saving the child. It's a way of gaining redemption for becoming pregnant, for having a sexual relationship, for having a child without being married. And so I saw that time and time again.
That's the LDS Family Services story, by the way. I have a Mormon background, so they'll kind of use this idea of this is a worthy family who can provide a family that the church idealizes, which is like a temple marriage, and it's supposed to be an eternal family, and you can't do that. And part of your road to redemption will be relinquishing your child so that they can have that, and that will also kind of redeem you as well. You did this good thing. So,
and that's not just LDS. Like we see that in evangelical church, in the Catholic churches as well. And a number of the mothers would choose these deeply religious families to raise their child, and then as they became more as they moved,
say it. No, I'm just kidding.
No, as they moved away from the church over time, that would become another rift that they had with their child and their child's adoptive family. So
some of them would become pretty aware of the context around which, because people might say, how much did they regret it later on? And I think a lot of the women that you spoke with seemed pretty forgiving of themselves because they could see that they made the best choice they could make in those circumstances with the information they had, frustrated by a system that didn't provide them with other opportunities. So there's definitely regret and frustration, but maybe not self-recrimination as much.
Yeah, I mean, I think the recrimination piece is really complicated because, and it gets into like the regret piece. And people often ask, like, do mothers regret their adoptions? And regret was really, really hard for them to weigh because so many of them would look back and be like, well, I didn't have any choice, so I can't regret it, right? This situation was out of my hands.
Yeah.
And I think for those mothers, they could move away from that recrimination piece because they felt like they had been so manipulated or coerced that they were able to give grace for their past selves.
Yeah.
But for a lot of other mothers, the regret question was complicated because I was asking them to choose between two different lives.
Yeah, they couldn't know. Would they have met their current partner
Right.
if they, stuff like that, yeah.
I mean, one mother that I asked, she relinquished her first daughter, went on, got married, had another child. And I asked her, I asked all of them if they felt regret about what happened. And she said, I think she put it really beautifully. She said, I don't know that I'd have the partner that I have and the child that I'm raising right now if I had made a different choice with my first pregnancy. But if I could create a world where I had all my children with me, that's the one that I want. And I think that really shows the struggle that they're going through. It's hard to, how do you feel about a counterfactual? What if?
Yeah. We all do it about certain things in our lives, but the stakes seem pretty high when it's a human life.
That desire to have your family together one way or another was what was really underlying.
Thanks for that added context, because I don't want to give people the impression that there's like one singular story. There obviously isn't. And it is really complicated when you start to get into what regret even is, or counterfactuals, like you said. You had the opportunity in your research to talk to a lot of women kind of around the time they relinquished and then 10 years later. So you got to see how those stories change. The story that a woman tells in the wake of relinquishing a child isn't going to be the same story that she tells 10 years later. And there were kind of patterns, there were kind of cycles. There was women often experienced that immediate sorrow and trauma, kind of into a honeymoon phase, you call it, where they're sort of trying to do their best, especially in open adoptions, to have pictures and feel love toward their child and maybe be connected to the adoptive family. And then a lot of them would move through what they would call coming out of the fog, where they sort of wake up to the honeymoon kind of goes away, I guess I would say. And it was reading their stories and seeing that cycle. I think it's one of the most powerful things your book does, is to show that there are a lot of different stories about adoption, but you've got to listen to when those stories are being told, who's telling them, what the purpose is. Are they doing advertising for an adoption agency? Are they on a message board talking about difficulties that they had? And by the way, I think this is part of the problem. We don't get a lot of these stories because being vocal about it can jeopardize their connection with their kid.
Absolutely.
So we also have incentives against some of these stories and against people being more critical of the adoption system itself, because that can put their relationships under threat. So, it's rough.
I think that was actually really, really telling, is that so many of my participants had a lot of questions about anonymity and how I was going to keep their stories as confidential as possible, because they knew that speaking critically about their experiences could jeopardize their relationship with their child. And I think that is that one. I took, of course, their confidentiality seriously. You can never guarantee it in a research project, but I was as careful as possible in the stories and in what I shared and how I chose to share them. But a lot of the mothers talked about, so I started the research in 2010, like kind of the heyday of message boards. And I found a lot of participants found me from message boards. So a lot of them were involved in message boards, because I would interview a couple mothers and then they would go post on the message boards, to call me up, which is great.
Snowball
effect. Yeah. And a lot of them would talk about, because there's so few spaces of support that birth mothers could find, and they would find each other on these message boards. And they would give a lot of support and care, particularly for mothers who had relinquished very recently, who were in that immediate grief period.
It's probably Facebook groups now.
It's probably Facebook groups. And a lot of them are closed. I'm not in them. They're closed, but which is appropriate. But the agencies hosted the message boards.
Oh.
So if anybody got critical on the message boards, they would get deleted. And now the message boards no longer exist. And I remember a number of mothers told me they started allowing briefly expectant mothers who were considering adoption to join the birth mother message boards. And they quickly stopped doing that, because mothers would come on and say, I'm thinking about adoption. What should I do? And everybody would say, don't do it. And so they were the first group to not, you had to have a completed adoption to be part of the support group on the message board. And then eventually the agency shut them down because the voices became too critical. But mothers talked about this in a number of different ways. So agencies will often have like a panel of birth parents come before prospective adoptive parents to talk to them about adoption. And I remember mothers would tell me that when they were in that honeymoon period, they would get invited back and back and back and back for panel after panel or to make videos or social media content. And then as soon as they started having more complicated feelings, they would stop being invited.
Mm-hmm. What were the things they'd start complaining about? Like, what did they want to see changed?
Yeah. I mean, they would say that they were really struggling with the open adoption, right? That they hadn't seen their kid in a while and they were frustrated or angry about that because they had been told that they were going to be more involved in their child's life, that they were going to have more contact with them. Most birth mothers in open adoptions do want to have more contact. So over 70% want to have more contact than they are currently getting in the open adoption agreement. So that's very common, a very common frustration.
They might even say, like, they didn't like how the agency handled it to begin with. They were maybe given promises or given sort of assurances that didn't pan out.
Yes.
They might see resource disparities, too.
Just a few. But they would also say that a lot of them would see their child struggle in some ways with being adopted, right? This is particularly true. They didn't expect that. That did not come up when they were talking about adoption.
Right.
And they would be disappointed or frustrated with that. That came up the fastest for children that were in transracial adoptions. So if you had...
that's something options counseling could go over.
Among many things, but yeah. And so if they brought up any of these pieces to say, my kid is biracial, black and white, and they are in a fully white community and they don't have any contact with their black family. They don't have any other black kids at their school. And I'm really frustrated with how the adoptive parents are handling this. That would be a problem. One of the mothers, her son ended up being neurodivergent. And she felt that his really conservative adoptive parents didn't quite know how to handle that. And were kind of responding by being like really strict with him and authoritarian with him. And she was really, they weren't.
It's not a therapeutic approach.
She wouldn't say that they were abusive, but she said very clearly that is not how I would parent him or how I would have chosen for him to be parented.
And she'd have to feel completely helpless in that because she doesn't have any right to
she has no right.
intervene at all.
I think a lot of them also saw their child's desire for them, right? They saw that their child wanted to be with them more. This is particularly true for mothers that had other children. Their relinquished children would want to be in more contact with their siblings. One of the mothers I interviewed, she had a son that she was raising and got pregnant very, very quickly with another baby. I think she had another boy. I think they were like 13 months apart. And she just didn't have capacity to care for another baby. And so she ended up relinquishing her second son and lived in the same neighborhood as the adoptive family. The boys went to school together. And her son who was adopted had a family that was much more financially well off than she was struggling as a single mom. And she saw the boys trying to maintain this friendship, whereas the son she was raising was really jealous that his brother had the new shoes, had the family vacation every year, got to do all these cool birthday parties, whatever. And the son that she'd relinquished was just jealous that her other son had her. Right?
Yeah.
And she actually kind of stepped back. And when I interviewed her, she hadn't talked to the son she had relinquished for about a year. Boys were both teenagers when we spoke. And he was really struggling with interacting with her. And so the open adoption was really just between her sons at that point. And she stepped back because she wanted them to be able to prioritize their relationship without her inserting herself, but recognizing that, like, for him, the son she had relinquished, his most important relationship was his brother at that point. And so I think you see all these ways that adoption can become very, very complicated, even when all parties mean well. And there are plenty of times when not all parties mean well, when parties are not showing regard, respect, love for everybody that's present.
And for the system to change, people have to ask for that and demand that. And there are some groups of adopted people who kind of lead the charge there. We talked about factors of why relinquishing parents might be less likely to do that, but also mentioning the same factors that led them to relinquish would probably make them less likely to get politically active, which is like levels of education, poverty, they're exhausted, they feel shame, they fear losing contacts with kids, and et cetera. So if the system's going to change, we need to think about what changes you'd like to see happen and who's kind of going to lead out there. And you introduce readers to a lens of reproductive justice. This is a way of thinking about society and relationships and individuals through a lens of equality, through a lens of fairness, through a lens of that kind of tries to get the exploitation out of it. So I wanted to kind of close there with a discussion about what needs to change overall, in your view, in the system through that reproductive justice lens.
So reproductive justice as a movement and as a theoretical lens is largely a response to reproductive rights as a framework for change. So reproductive rights is about legal rights and access to make different reproductive choices. Reproductive justice is really about what are the circumstances of people's lives that give them control and autonomy over their reproductive choice. So you can have the legal right to have an abortion or not have a legal right to have an abortion. But if you can't afford an abortion that you want to have, or you can't afford to parent a kid that you do want to parent, or you don't have a safe home or community to raise your child in, then you don't really have a choice, right? And the thinking of reproductive justice came out of, Black feminist thought, and is a really crucial lens, I think, for understanding that. And this is actually where the whiteness of private adoption, I think, has siloed it from a lot of reproductive justice thinking, because the market demand for so long in private adoption was for white babies. That is no longer the case. So we are now seeing more and more women of color disproportionately participating in the private adoption system, and they have always been targeted more in the public adoption system, which is foster care, because we know those families are policed to a far greater degree. So you have a lot of advocacy led by adopted people in the private adoption space, and you have a lot of advocacy led by impacted parents in the family policing space. And I think we are seeing increasing breaking of these silos because the same systems of family separation are working in all these different ways. And I think that is where the movement is going to go, is how do we bring a lens of reproductive justice, economic, social reform together to really build systems that support families from the ground up. And this is why when people talk about, well, what does a family preservation agenda look like? I always say, well, the good news is it's going to impact millions of more families that aren't impacted by adoption or family separation in any way, because it's just about building a social safety net. It's about making sure people have access to housing, to childcare, to food stability, to living wages, to all of these pieces that just allow people to navigate their way. And we have made policy choices that make parenthood untenable for people. And that's where you see separations, both public and private ones. And I think that the real momentum is building in that space to reframe how we're thinking about care and safety and support.
And I think more progressive-minded people are likelier to pick up this charge, but there's still some obstacles there as you talk about pro-choice feminists who, for example, they love the idea of chosen family, right? They love that this is an option for queer couples to do this. They honor adoptive families as legitimate families, and they might not take a step back and look at the economic conditions and the kind of considerations we raised here. So reproductive justice, I think, requires us to take a further step back, to zoom out a little bit more and think about the privilege that's happening within the system of adoption and really going after it from there. And there are some people that just outright advocate to abolish the adoption system in general. This is where I wondered about your role, because you're a social scientist. You try to separate personal feelings from the things that you report, but you also have a kind of advocacy role, right? So you have preferences of what kind of policies you'd like to see happen, I imagine.
Yeah.
Do you talk about those? Do you take a side in kind of people saying we just need to reform the system versus people who are like, actually, the system is already too unequal. We really just need to do away with it?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are reforms that can be done in the service of creating real change to the system. And then there are reforms that are just about putting a Band-Aid over things that allow the system to endure. And I am more interested in reframing how I think about this on a fundamental level. And I think the idea of abolition, and this is not just about adoption, but when we talk about prisons, when we talk about poverty, these deep entrenched social structures that we believe are immutable and inevitable. When we talk about abolition, it's not just about like making adoption illegal. No one is arguing we should make adoption illegal. It's about building systems that replace these ones that we have that aren't serving the people they claim to serve. And so, and this is Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about abolition is about presence, not absence. It's not about just getting rid of something. It's about building something else instead. And that's when I think we talk about social safety nets, systems of care, kinship care, and rethinking more broadly ways that we understand safety for children and support for families and how we begin to piece that together. That's what the abolition vision is. I include, I think all of the advocates that I include in that last chapter are adopted people themselves that are doing this work to reframe adoption from a reproductive justice lens and to begin to envision what abolition could look like. I obviously find a lot deeply appealing about their model. And I think that that is the advocacy that we should be listening to most closely is people who have lived this, who have lived the impacts of this system their entire lives, and who want to think of ways that we can create a better world. Even if I am more comfortable with a more reformist approach or a more incremental approach, I think that the lives and stories of impacted people should always be our North Star as far as what we are moving towards. And that's why I wanted to end the book with that.
And I just want to say, before we get to regrets, challenges, and surprises, I want to say what my perhaps biggest surprise in this book was. I kind of expected women and relinquishing parents to go through real trauma and difficulty, but that over time they could heal and a lot of them do. They continue to live their lives and so on. But their attitude about the adoption itself, not a single one of them, according to your research, said that they were happier later on because of that choice.
Yeah.
None of them said they felt better about making that choice over time. And out of all the women that you interviewed, only 2 of them said they basically felt the same.
Yeah.
The rest of them had come to feel worse about it. And to me, like you said, the North Star ought to be the real lived experiences of the people who are doing the relinquishing and the people who are being adopted. And the people who are being adopted, as we talk about in other episodes, have a lot of difficulties that they go through. And the people who are doing the relinquishing don't report being happier about it at the end. That was a big, big surprise to me, honestly. And maybe it shouldn't have been. I don't know.
I mean, I think we just have to let go of the idea that the way we are currently practicing adoption is about meeting the needs of children and families of origin, and recognize that the way the current adoption system is built is entirely about generating money and income for the brokers, and about meeting the needs of adoptive families.
And for some, they think it will decrease abortions, and the research shows that's not true.
No.
I mean, the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade tried to make it all about adoption. Isn't this great for adoption? And it's just not true. Like, as we pointed out, when people face a choice, they would much rather keep a child or abort a child than relinquish a child. So the solution to abortion thing that the Supreme Court's trying to push through is also just, it's not there. So,
well, and that's, I am bringing a left of center approach to my work, right? Because I believe that that's where the data takes you as far as the public health data on the safety and legitimacy of the needs for abortion care in communities. Like, from that sense, it's a deeply political lens. And that's who I kind of wrote the book for, right? As I'm going to write for people that believe the 2 premises I think you have to believe to be part of the argument are, 1, that people deserve reproductive autonomy. Right. And 2,
make their
that
choices.
poor people are capable of being good and loving parents. right? That poverty...
And deserve support.
Right. Well, and that poverty doesn't automatically disqualify you from parenting, right? Those are kind of like the two core things that the argument is built on. And if you don't agree with those things, that's fine. I'm not really talking to you, right? Like you can read it and I hope you'll get something out of it. But like I'm trying to build an argument for people who share these sort of fundamental starting points with me, but still don't understand very much about adoption or don't see how adoption fits into those two pieces. But I think the argument that I could offer the right and that I try to offer people who disagree with me on abortion is that actually if you want to prevent abortions, building support for parenting is the fastest way to make that possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of putting all of this money and resources into promoting adoption, the best way to dissuade people from getting abortions is to make parenting feel like a path they can actually take. And that's actually a family preservation. That's the common ground, right? For so long, both pro-choice and anti-abortion camps have tried to make adoption the common ground. And instead, parenting is and always should have been that common ground.
Well, and I think the main thing we can recognize right away what's stopping them from doing that. And I think it's basically boils down to racism and anti-queer sentiment in general, which is these families aren't worthy of having these kids. There's fears about race replacement and all kinds of other things that we talk about in other episodes. So it's not entirely like irrational, so to speak, for them to not accept this obvious solution, which is support moms, because they don't want to support those moms.
They're right. Because they're not being honest about what they're trying to accomplish.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's Gretchen Sisson. We're talking about her book, Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. She's a qualitative sociologist who studies abortion and adoption at Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health. That's in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Services at UC San Francisco. One of the longer titles, Gretchen, that I think I've...
It's a lot. It's a lot of words.
but it's a very important title, too. I really urge people to check the book out because they'll get to hear the first-person accounts interspersed in your chapters. And that's kind of what I try to do on Relationscapes. I wanted to talk to you mostly from the sociological standpoint because that's the strength you bring. And we'll have other episodes where we talk to relinquishing parents so we can hear more directly from them. But for people that want to do that right now, check out the book Relinquished. That's where you can get these first-person accounts. It's terrific. So Gretchen, thanks a lot for putting this book together and getting these voices out there.
Thank you, Blair.
All right, we'll be right back with regrets, challenges, and surprises after this. Hey, everybody. I wanted to take a quick second to say that if you're enjoying this show, I have another podcast that I think you might enjoy. It's called What Your Therapist Thinks. This is a mental health show where actual licensed therapists come on and open up about what they're really going through, what they're thinking about as you're sitting across from them. And if you haven't been in therapy or you haven't been in a while, I think this show will give you a really nice inside look at what to expect and the kind of insights that you can get from therapy on things like performance anxiety and why people cheat, what people pleasing really looks like and how to deal with it, what's up with ketamine therapy, and a lot more topics besides. So two things kind of make this a standout show for me. The first is that co-host Felicia Keller-Boyle is a licensed therapist, so I like having somebody who's trained and has professional obligations on board to kind of speak to the best thinking in the field and kind of, do best practices type stuff, right? And I put a lot of stock in people who have that kind of training and background. And also her co-host, Christy Plantinga, is sort of a stand-in for people like me. I'm not a therapist, I'm not trained, but I'm interested in mental health. That's kind of what Christy does for the show. They're a dynamic duo, and I really love the conversations that they have with other licensed mental health professionals that they bring on in each episode. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, again, I recommend you check it out wherever you get your podcasts. It's called What Your Therapist Thinks. We're back with Gretchen Sisson talking about the book Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. And we always close with regrets, challenges, and surprises to choose your own adventure for our guests where they can talk about something they'd change about the book now that it's out in the world, what the hardest part about putting the project together was, or something that really surprised them in the course of putting the book together. And Gretchen, you can choose any of those kind of, whichever kind of gives us the best story, whatever sings to you in this moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think one regret, and I remember my first book event, someone asked me, like, what isn't in the book that you wish was in the book? And I was like, everything's in the book. I said it all, everything I need to say. And now I almost a year and a half later, I have a very different answer. The one thing that I think is missing, who knows how many things are missing in this book, but
There's only one.
There's only one. One of the things that I think is missing in the book that I wish I had engaged with more was I don't really talk about disability and the way that disability is used as a grounds for taking children or separating families or dismissing people's ability to parent. It didn't come up, and there were a lot of mental health challenges that came up, postpartum psychosis, some other mental health diagnoses that came out in the book that I write about. But none of my participants really brought up like physical disability or those sorts of pieces. And I do wish that I had been able to explore that more. There's a really great book called Unfit Parent by Jessica Slice. And I really enjoyed reading that. I learned a lot from that. And that's something that I'm going to be thinking about in future ongoing research, because I think that, interestingly, she's an adoptive mother as well. And so I think that there's a lot of conversation to be had there around the ways that disabled people rely on adoption to build their families, as well as have their own parenthood policed and regulated in different ways. So I wish that I had included that in some capacity. It didn't come up in my data collection, which is why it was missing. But I feel like I could have explored that more in other ways. And that's a regret that I have, that I didn't include that more.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. And in fact, I'll recommend right now fellow traveler episodes, I call them. So these are kind of connected to the discussion here. And we actually talked to Jessica Slice earlier this year, about Unfit Parent. And so people can check that episode out as well as the book. And then we also had an episode with Eliza Hull. And she also she compiled a book of essays by a bunch of disabled parents, and so it comes up there as well. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, and agree it definitely fits into this conversation. And no book can cover it all. So and ableism kind of sneaks under the radar sometimes too. And Gretchen, thanks a ton for spending the time talking to us about Relinquished. Highly recommend this book. It's a terrific book. Are you working on any, what's your current project right now?
So I am actually just about to start data collection on a new project. And I think one piece of feedback that I heard a lot about this book was, well, what about the parents that really can't do it, right? What about the parents that are struggling, who are incarcerated or are entirely unhoused?
Of time, I skipped that question.
Or
that's on my list.
Or who have addiction. And I think that that's a valid question. And I think that if we want to talk seriously about what it means to create systems of care, it requires looking at those really hard cases more deeply, not just in the context of adoption, but what does it actually mean to value people's parenthood and and value their connection to their child. And I think that kind of broadly is what I want to look at next.
Well, Gretchen, I enjoyed Relinquished so much, and I look forward to more from you down the road.
Thanks, Blair.
Thanks for listening to Relationscapes. If this is your first time, welcome. I hope you'll check out some other episodes. In fact, I'm going to recommend a fellow traveler episode to this one. If the topic is something you want to hear more about, check out Angela Tucker's episode. It's called The Truth About Transracial Adoption. And will you do me a favor? I'm asking people to take a second to rate and review Relationscapes in Apple Podcasts. Last year, I made a goal to hit 100 ratings by the end of the year, which we did. But now the ratings are kind of coming in a little bit slower. So I need people to go rate and review. Let's see those ratings and reviews come in. Matter of fact, I'm just going to go read one on the fly here. Let's see. All right, here's a review from SP_review. Love that underscore. It says, Relationscapes is an informative, inviting, genuinely compelling podcast that explores relationships with depth and clarity. Hodges brings a thoughtful, steady presence to each episode, guiding conversations in a way that feels both informative and warmly human. The podcast tackles complex interpersonal dynamics without being preachy or abstract. It's accessible to listeners no matter their fluency on a topic. It also provides guidance in a way that's actually actionable. The discussions are well-researched and reflective, and they unfold using a conversational style that invites listeners in. Wow, I mean, that's one of the most specific reviews we've got. Thanks, SP Review. Thanks for doing that. You can also leave a review. Just go to Apple Podcasts and let me know what you think about the show. You can also rate the show in Spotify if you're still listening over there. Mates of State provides our theme song. I'm your host, Blair Hodges, an independent journalist in Salt Lake City, and I hope to see you soon in another episode.